Hello and welcome to Asian Insider. I'm your host Bhagyashree Garekar and we're recording this episode on Tuesday, the 13th of January, 2026. Happy New Year, everyone. Now, with me today are two guests to talk about the events in Venezuela that have shaken the world and have implications for all of us. Dr. Joseph Ledford is a fellow at the Hoover Institution. His research focuses on American power, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And that very much makes him the man of the moment. And we are going to ask him to interpret for us President Donald Trump's power play. Joseph is speaking to us from Stanford, California. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you for the invitation, and happy to be here. Happy New Year as well.
And in Houston, Texas, we have Mr. Carl Larry. He is an oil and gas industry analyst. He manages sales at Enverus, which is an analytics company focused on the energy industry. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you for having me.
My first question to you, Joseph. Now, it's been 10 days since the US military operation in Venezuela, which captured a sitting president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, and flew them to New York to face trial for narco-terrorism. Now, could you tell us what specific foreign policy goals for the US have been achieved here?
Great question. The United States is currently seeking to turn the Western Hemisphere's worst actor into a good neighbor. Operation Absolute Resolve was a stunning tactical success, but it remains to be seen if it can be translated into a long-term political success. And by this, I mean the threefold process that the administration is currently seeing through: stabilization, recovery, and transition. Now, specific details about how this will transpire are few, and we have to interpret the president's comments, which have run a full gambit of he's the acting president, we're running Venezuela, a lot of the usual showmanship that is characteristic of Donald Trump, in comparison with Secretary Rubio, who has tried to make the case that this is more of a regime management than regime change. The administration immediately has sought to bring Nicolas Maduro and his wife to stand trial in New York, as you described in your question, but also limit the flow of narcotics, limit the flow of irregular migration, and most importantly, remove Venezuela from being a beachhead for America's geopolitical rivals: China, Russia, Iran, and Iran's proxy Hezbollah, which has operated in Venezuela. Those are the primary objectives. I think secondary, there was a psychological effect that the administration hoped to produce with such a stunning operation of overwhelming force, and that is to put fear in the hearts of the regime in Cuba, in Nicaragua, next door in Colombia. I'll note that the Colombian president is now set to come meet with Donald Trump next month at the White House. And finally, Mexico. Much of the Venezuelan operation has to do with the United States' relationship with Mexico, and particularly its security relationship. The Marina Party had been a supporter of Nicolas Maduro and criticized the intervention, and the administration, in trying to partner with Mexico, is also trying to isolate the ruling party politically in the region.
Okay, so we hear you some pretty clearly well defined objectives here. But I noticed you didn't say the word oil. And actually, we've heard President Trump talk a lot about it. I mean, in nearly all his remarks about Venezuela, there has been a mention of oil. So what does oil have to do with it?
Well, that's an
Or
astute,
not have to do with it for that
that's an
matter?
astute point, and pointing out that I did not mention oil as an ends. It's more of a means, and let me explain what I mean by that. President Trump has talked about taking Venezuelan oil, owning the Venezuelan oil industry, but the United States does not need Venezuelan oil. Rather, this is a measure to use the oil to isolate Cuba. Currently, Mexico is providing oil to Cuba as a lifeline, but I think that will continue to be a point of contention, especially as we move further along in the USMCA renegotiation. And more importantly, oil is needed to stabilize and produce economic recovery in Venezuela. Obviously, the president has talked about giving access to oil to American companies, foreign companies, but I wouldn't necessarily, from my position, despite what the president says, seeing as the ultimate end that the United States needs crude oil from Venezuela. It's just certainly not the case. It's more a strategic means to pursue those political ends that I talked about, specifically in stabilizing Venezuela.
Okay, so we hear you. This is oil as strategic means, like you say, to stabilize the economy. But let me ask Carl now, because you're the oil guy here. So, what was the first thing that came to your mind, when you caught the news that this is what was happening in Venezuela?
The first thing came to my mind is that we've seen something similar when we invaded Iraq. We all thought that there was going to be a great flow of oil coming from the Middle East, and we were going to partner with them. But the issue that came up as we entered into the country is that the production was nowhere near what we thought it was going to be. The infrastructure really fell apart during that whole regime there. And so I think we might see something similar when we go to Venezuela. I know the knee-jerk reaction was that we have a surplus of oil already, but now we're going to have an access to more oil. As Joseph just mentioned, it wasn't about oil for us. It was about oil that we could help produce. And that's not going to come quickly. It's going to probably be worse than we expect. The infrastructure is probably going to be in disarray. Ever since PDVSA got overturned back in '03, the decline has been pretty big. So going in there right now, I think that if there is oil and if there's production that we can help with, it's going to be down the road, maybe 5 years down the road or even longer. But right now, that's not really going to be an implication to our system here.
I see. But what's the bottom line, Carl? I mean, I think this is one thing that might politically help President Trump as well. The point about cheaper oil to U.S. customers, and as we know, gas is the lifeline for many Americans going to work and so on, especially as public services. Public transportation is not as good and perhaps many other parts of the world. So it's that critical. Are we going to get cheaper oil in the US? And even for, in Singapore, for instance, are we going to get cheaper petrol prices?
When it comes to markets, it's really about perception. What do we think? What do we see? What's happening, and what do we react on? The idea of more oil in the world being produced out of Venezuela, that's going to have an effect on prices coming down. But directly when it comes to oil in America, the oil that's produced in Venezuela right now is a heavier oil. We don't really use a lot of that. If we do, it's to blend with lighter oil to reduce margins for refining, to make gasoline cheaper, to make diesel fuel, jet fuel. But a lot of that oil that they produce is similar to the oil that we get from Canada. So it's going to be a balance of trying to figure out who gets what, where. But I think, again, we're going to go back to what Joseph said about how it really affects the oil going to the rest of the world more so than it does to America. But as long as we keep that pressure on oil coming down or the production higher, oil prices can stay low.
I see. Joseph, we've heard President Trump in recent days say that U.S. does not want China and Russia and Iran as neighbors. Now, what exactly have China and Russia and Iran been doing in Venezuela that the U.S. finds so objectionable?
The United States objects to their presence, both economically, politically, militarily. Iran has used Venezuela as a base for operations, particularly Hezbollah, which had operated in South America and probably does still to a smaller extent in the tri-border region to raise money to fund terrorism in the Middle East against American allies and partners. China is heavily invested and involved in Venezuela, provides some military means, and permits the Venezuelan regime to operate, providing surveillance technology. Russia has scaled back its involvement in Venezuela in the last few years, being embroiled in a war of aggression against Ukraine, but Russia provided them with military equipment, intelligence, and I'll just note that the Chinese government operates signal intelligence bases in Cuba, and that intelligence flows from the Cubans into Venezuela to be used at the pleasure of the regime, because the Cubans have built the security infrastructure. As your viewers may have read in the news that many Cubans were dispatched by the Delta Force during the raid because they provided the security apparatus for Nicolas Maduro. So on top of the regime itself, from the United States' perspective, operating essentially as an illegitimate government criminal enterprise, it was aided by America's enemies that used Venezuela as a beachhead. I'll use this analogy, which I think may be apt for the situation, what Havana, Cuba was during the Cold War for the United States, Caracas had become in the 21st century era of great power competition.
Uh, right, but particularly about China, we know it's a major actor, major investor, and trader for nearly all countries in South America.
Mhm.
Um, does the US find that itself objectionable?
I would say that this administration certainly does. That over the last 10 years, China has gained a massive economic, political, and military footprint in Latin America. It's the largest trading partner of South America, the second largest trading partner of the region. And if you reflect on the recent national security strategy, it's not completely explicitly about China, but one of the main objectives in the Western Hemisphere section is to deny non hemispheric powers both a place in the Western Hemisphere, but what is termed access to strategic vital assets. I'll note here that one of the first things the second Trump administration did was target the Panama Canal. It was in President Trump's inauguration speech. Marco Rubio's first visit as Secretary of State was to Panama. That was the first time the Secretary of State had visited Central America as their first trip abroad since 1912. And this was very much on the mind of the administration from the beginning. And here I'll also note that Secretary of State Marco Rubio was keen on these issues as a senator, worried about China first beginning with economic influence, but then using that to political ends in Latin America and exporting its political system. But now there is I think, a receding and ebbing of that influence as the political tide has changed in Latin America. This raid on Venezuela happens at a time in which the peak tide is receding. Conservative leaders have swept into power across Latin America over the last 3 years. I suspect the trend will still continue this year with the election in Colombia, maybe not in Brazil, probably not. But I'll note here that one of the critics of the raid is the current president of Chile, but the president-elect of Chile, the conservative caste, actually supported the arrest of Maduro in very explicit terms. And so this is happening in a context in which Latin American governments are having to question their own relationship with China. Many are not opposed to engage with China, and they have longstanding relationships with China. But the United States, to be charitable, does not look kindly on it.
Okay. Carl, now in connection with the narratives, I think that are building up around the Venezuelan, the military operations in Venezuela, this word petrodollar keeps popping up. You know, that this is the real reason, and people do believe this, that, you know, this is why this had to happen. Now, can you demystify it for us? What is petrodollar? Why does it matter? To whom does it matter? You know, now we have Venezuela selling its oil in US dollars.
Yeah. So, when we think about the petrodollar, basically dollars based in oil, similar to what this generation might think of as Bitcoin, dollars invested in blockchain. We don't have a deep understanding of it, but we understand the basics of it. And it goes back to what we were just talking about here is that, Venezuela as a foothold for countries like China and Russia, a lot of those dollars that were being generated revenue in the economy of Venezuela were based around oil. So seeing that kind of siphon off, seeing that kind of readjusted to where that money's going and who's going to be buying, who's going to be selling, is really now where we see this, this strength of the petrodollar, but not so much a petrodollar as we've seen before that's based around OPEC, but a petrodollar that's really based around U.S. interests. So it's going to be interesting going forward where we see the strength of that economy going to the rest of the world.
Okay, so Joseph, we are starting to talk about Venezuela in a little bit more normal terms. You know, we're talking about what lies ahead. We're, I guess, kind of over the shock of the operation. So my question is, when do you think Venezuelans are actually going to see benefits coming down to their country? And what kind of benefits would these be, and when?
That's an excellent question. The administration has set a long-term timeline. The president himself said it would be at least 18 months, if not longer. They are trying to set expectations. They see that this regime management approach is not going to take place next week or 6 months from now, much to the consternation of those who support the Democratic opposition. Maria Corina Machado, recent recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, and Edmundo Gonzalez, that there were concerns, particularly amongst the Florida delegation on the Republican side, of why the Democratic opposition were not immediately installed. And this comes down to stabilization. And to your question about seeing the benefits from stabilization and recovery, the first and foremost is an end to repression. There was an announcement from Jorge Rodriguez, the head of the National Assembly, who's the brother of the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, that the government would begin to release prisoners. They claimed that they were releasing 100, but Alfredo Romero, head of the political prisoners, the most prominent political prisoner organization in Venezuela, could only verify about half of those. So they've released about 50 people. So that's one benefit, is the repression stops from the security forces, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And so Delcy Rodriguez has a fine line to walk between remaining the acting president of Venezuela and perhaps not facing charges herself and putting an end to this. But of course, this has to do with the different power blocks within the government, because those who control the security services are not in the Rodriguez camp. Beyond simply stopping state repression is a stabilization of the economy. That remains to be seen, as Carl could articulate much better than me. The sheer amount of investment to revive the Venezuelan oil industry, we're talking $100 billion. As was reflected in the president's meeting with oil executive, Exxon is extremely skeptical of investing in Venezuela. And it's a chicken or the egg situation. How do you stabilize the oil industry if there's not political stability? But political stability rests on political legitimacy, which leads me to the last benefit that I'll talk about quickly, is rebuilding civil society and opening up the political space in which we can have legitimate elections. Of course, Venezuela had an election July 28, 2024, and the Democratic opposition won decisively. But now it seems that the administration is trying to work towards that. I think ultimately Venezuelans are going to judge success by the improvement in their daily lives. But it's a long road ahead. And of course, what I say right now may be completely different by the time this goes live.
That's a real possibility. But one quick follow-up to what you just said. Now, you speak about the Nobel laureate of last year, Nobel Peace Laureate, Machado, but she is not in the government. Is that a contradiction, or what is what's the plus minuses of this situation for the U.S. and why this? I mean, that's a question people are asking everywhere. Why did he not ask, Machado to form the government after, taking away Maduro?
Great question. I think it ultimately comes down to a prudent approach to regime change, learning the lessons of Iraq. The Iraq War syndrome looms large over this. Certainly, Americans have a deep aversion to any sort of involvement in war and regime change for good reason. I think the administration, when the decision was ultimately made, which, by the way, proceeded over at least 6 months of direct diplomacy with Maduro, where President Trump had made many offers for amnesty if Maduro would simply leave, until on December 23rd, Maduro rejected the last offer. The president leaned heavily, I believe, based on the reporting. I don't have a security clearance. I don't have access to the information. Based on the reporting, the CIA had made a determination at the direction of the director, John Ratcliffe, in an assessment that simply removing the entire regime and installing the Democratic opposition would lead to chaos because of the control of the security services. Most of the Democratic opposition aren't actually in the country. And so there was real concern that if you had a, let's say, Iraqi style de-Baathification and complete regime change, that would ultimately be chaos. So from the administration standpoint, it was simply not reasonable or feasible to bring Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, who had won the election, back from overseas and install them as a government. Now, I will say that Machado is set to meet the president on Thursday. The president seems to be open to engaging with the Democratic opposition. But right now, I certainly do not see the Democratic opposition being installed unless it's through another round of legitimate elections. And this is exactly what Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that they were trying to work for through this threefold process. And I'll note that this process has overlapping mechanisms. It doesn't seem to be neatly sequenced. But I think ultimately the administration would like to see Machado or someone from the Democratic opposition stand for the presidency in another election.
Okay. Carl, you just heard Joseph say that I think $100 billion is what he said is needed in the US, in the Venezuelan oil industry. What is your take on it? And where do you think American oil companies can make a difference to the Venezuelan oil industry?
Yeah, it's kind of layered, and it goes back to what he said: instability or lack of stability or lack of direction for whatever matters right now. American oil companies don't want to invest money where they're going to lose money, and we're talking a very large number here. And I think that going back again, what he said is that when you do find stability will be based on what the Venezuelan people believe and want to see success. So going into Venezuela, oil companies going there, there's an investment in operations, there's investment in equipment, there's investment in a budget going out 10 years. But is there investment in labor? Are we going to bring people there? Or are we going to find the Venezuelans that were displaced from 2003 coming back, saying, we want to come back at work, we want to come back to our country, we want to be part of this stabilization and this growth of a government? And that's where you can start to see investment really going there and making a difference. Once the people believe that we can do this together, then they'll go back, and then we can see money invested. But until then, Donald Rumsfeld has always said this, it's an unknown unknown. We don't know what's going to happen going forward because we don't see a democracy there yet. We don't see, an alliance with their new regime altogether yet. So once we get those things factored in and once we get them settled, then we can start moving forward.
How long do you think that might take?
It looks like it's progressing in the right direction now, but every little hiccup or every little step forward or step back is going to be judged and measured. So I think if there's a good number, maybe it's a year to three that we could see this happen. It could happen sooner. It could happen much longer, depending on how we see that democracy, or should say that government, really upright.
Also, a related question in that now that oil exports from Venezuela are not under U.S. sanctions, America has its own oil industry, which is sizable. It's the world's largest producer of oil and gas, and among the top exporters. So how does this developments in Venezuela impact US's own oil industry, the shale industry? Is it bad news for them?
It really goes into like who needs what oil. Like shale oil is very light, very easy to process, very tailored to a lot of the American U.S. refineries. But in other parts of the world, they do use heavier oil. China and Russia are very big, importers of that oil because of that. They have smaller refineries. They use heavier oil, which is cheaper usually in the market and easier to produce for them. But it displaces a lot of other countries that are really putting that oil out there. Canada, we talked about earlier, that brings a lot of heavier oil down to the U.S. is a good example. They can bring it to us, but can they ship it over to Asia or Russia, or any country in that area? Not really, because they're constrained by pipeline issues and bringing it to the coast, getting it on a ship, moving over. That's the advantage Venezuela does have. But it really starts to play in now. Who are the major players to those consumers? Not so much America. So where does America stand? We stand where we're at today. We still are going to be exporting oil. We're still going to be importing certain grades of oil. But the rest of the other countries, say OPEC, are really going to have to make adjustments as they see developments go in Venezuela.
But the shale miners themselves, are they impacted by I know you don't fully subscribe to the idea that oil price is going to go any lower, but we know that the industry is already having difficulties and they've had layoffs in thousands in Texas where you are. So is that not going to impact them badly?
The baseline of oil, where producers, especially in the U.S., are breaking even, fluctuate between $30 and $50, depending on where it's at. So the real impact that we'll see here in the U.S. is that can we find a trade partner with Venezuela? Is there going to be other trade other than oil that can support our economy? Trade deficit is a very big deal. But right now, the biggest stimulus for U.S. shale oil stimulus or detraction really comes down to the growth of our economy, and then obviously interest rates. Producers want to see lower interest rates, lower borrowing rates. Ways to get equipment, ways to get labor at a fair cost. Inflation has really driven that here in the U.S. when it comes to shale plays. So it's balancing our economy first, not really so much the price of oil when it comes down to where we see success there.
Joseph, this is a two-pronged question that I have for you. Firstly, you mentioned Iraq. Are there any operative lessons that the U.S. ought not to repeat? That's one. You mentioned de-Baathification that was carried out in Iraq, and which hasn't happened in Venezuela. But is there anything else that comes to mind that shouldn't be done? Afghanistan, for instance, is another example which Americans don't remember that kindly. So is there anything therefore that you will be watching or grading the Trump administration against?
Yes, I think there are many lessons. The administration seems to have learned a lot of them with their approach to not seek a full-scale invasion, occupation, and provisional government. Essentially, what we're seeing here is the United States is using a naval quarantine and air power to discipline what they see as a rogue state. Trump is governing from afar. He refers to himself as the acting president. But what the United States is trying to do is manage this from abroad. Let's say 21st century gunboat diplomacy, except it's by aircraft carrier. And the administration, I think, would be well suited to work on the communications aspect. They've given a long-term horizon. They've talked about a threefold process, but be explicit to the American people about what our national interest is. Marco Rubio had defended the operation on the grounds that it's in the American national interest, and the administration has to continue to explain to Americans why we are undertaking this, why we are so involved in the Western Hemisphere, and make the case. The president should take advantage of being the president. I would actually recommend that the administration perform an Oval Office address directly to the American people to lay out the stakes, lay out exactly what we are attempting to do and what we plan to do. So strategic communications, one, be realistic about metrics and benchmarks. It seems that internally the administration has some benchmarks that they would like to see to measure progress, to be realistic about the situation. But regarding de-Baathification, dealing with the security services is going to be the trickiest part of this. I mean, outside of trying to actually revive the Venezuelan oil industry, it's dealing with Diosdado Cabello, Vladimir Padrino, dealing with the armed services and security forces, and determining how to do that. And I think that is what's really informed the gradual process of dealing with an acting president in Delcy Rodriguez. But other than that, I think those are the most pertinent lessons right now. But also realizing when the United States should disengage, if they actually can. I mean, we're in a different situation here because it's our geopolitical neighborhood. So it's the Pottery Barn issue. If you break it, you buy it, and we bought it.
Right. And I guess everyone hopes you don't break it. But, spectacular that this operation was, it actually didn't go down so well in many capitals. And the reason for that is obvious because, it was a violation of international law and the UN Charter, right? National sovereignty, territorial integrity, those are the kind of things that everyone upholds and certainly hopes will be respected in their case. So the question is, what can the US do to recover from it?
American presidents do not find the UN Charter as a binding constraint on decision making. When a president determines that he needs to make an aggressive action in defense of American national interests, they find it to be the Constitution. There's been a long-standing bipartisan tradition. The administration seemed to initially rely on an Office of Legal Counsel memo from 1989 involving the Panamanian Operation Just Cause, the so-called abduction operation. My understanding is there's an updated OLC memo that will be made available to Congress. Notwithstanding that, the majority of the criticism that the United States has faced from the administration standpoint has been from geopolitical rivals. France and Spain have voiced concerns about this. In Latin America, most countries either supported it or remained quiet, other than Mexico and Chile and Brazil, but the incoming Chilean president wasn't supportive of it. Most OAS countries had long-standing issues with Venezuela. In fact, the issue in Venezuela since 2013, when Nicolas Maduro took power, had destabilized most of the region. Obviously, one of the critics, the Colombian president, is coming to meet with Donald Trump and sort of has stepped back from his criticism. But with all of that being said, I think in the case of Singapore and our Asian allies and partners is to see the measures that we are undertaking in Venezuela, whether they agree with it or not, is that the United States under the Trump administration will use force to defend what it sees as its national interest, and in this case is a peaceful Indo-Pacific region. There's been a lot of commentary about, oh, this will embolden China, this will embolden Russia, but China and Russia are not constrained by international law. They're constrained by the hardware built by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. And the Trump administration is certainly apt to deploy those if it sees that it is necessary in regions to keep the peace. And lastly, I'll mention that some of the other criticisms is the United States' involvement in Venezuela in the Western Hemisphere is a measure of retrenchment from the world. Or I would posit it's actually the opposite. The Trump administration finds that what would even be the point of great power competition with China if the United States allowed China to destabilize its geopolitical backyard, which gives rise to issues that affect Americans, which drive our politics. Most of the issues that were central to Donald Trump's political program, narcotics, migration, trade, China, radiate from the Western Hemisphere. So what happened in Venezuela should not be a surprise to Americans or the world.
You spoke of an Oval Office address that you said Trump would be, I guess, well advised to make and communicate clearly what's being achieved here, what's intended, and so on. Do you think, as part of that address, it might be pertinent or useful or actually even helpful for America and for the sake of its image abroad to talk about what does the US have in mind here that is for the benefit of the world, because that is a question for the rest of the world.
Yes, I think the president would be well advised to talk about the destruction wrought by drugs on our European allies. What seems to be understated in the case of Venezuela is that Colombia produces more cocaine today than it ever did, more than Pablo Escobar could ever dream of. And much of that was facilitated to Europe through West Africa by the Nicolas Maduro regime and the transnational criminal organizations that it aided and abetted. So currently, France and Belgium are dealing with transnational crime to a degree they've never seen before. The Belgian government is likely to deploy troops to the streets in Brussels. So I think the president would be well advised to say in public what is said behind closed doors, that we are doing this on behalf of the rest of the world that deals with the issue of transnational criminal organizations, which, by the way, I think are a 21st century threat. South Asia, Southeast Asia has their own versions of this throughout the Middle East and Europe, and is centrally connected to what happens in the Western Hemisphere. I think if the president can make a global case that it's not just necessarily about the hemisphere, and that the United States is committed to aiding allies and partners with our own policies in our geopolitical neighborhood. Again, this is more about the president using the so-called bully pulpit in order to drive the message home about what we're doing, in which it looks less self-interested. Yes, we are undertaking this in the American national interest, but it is also to the betterment of the region, to most of Latin America that have dealt with profound ramifications from the Maduro regime, and then also allies and partners that are dealing with transnational crime that is fueled by the narcotics that the Nicolas Maduro regime facilitated the transshipment of.
Right. That's an interesting take on that situation, and I do wonder whether we're going to hear that from the Trump administration, and also considering that we are possibly looking at Iran and Greenland related US moves, probably in the near future. So we might have to call you back to the studio for that. But for now, I think this is a wrap. Thank you, Dr. Joseph Ledford and Mr. Carl Larry, for your insights. This is Asian Insider. I'm Bhagyashree Garekar. This episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani, our producer in Singapore. And I must add that it's past midnight there. So thank you, Faiza, for staying up, and all through this conversation. I hope it was interesting for everybody. You enjoyed this show and will share it with your family and friends. You can also sign up for our Asian Insider newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.